Welcome to Life Stories. Have you ever felt like everything you've worked for, everything you've believed in, could shatter with just one sentence? What if the very people who were supposed to support you were the ones who betrayed you most? This is the story of Samantha, who, on what should have been a perfect Thanksgiving, found out that the life she'd carefully built was nothing more than a lie. When the truth came crashing down, it wasn't her husband who stood by her side, it was her son. What happens when your own child has more courage than the person you thought you could trust forever? Stay with us, because what comes next will change everything you thought you knew about love, betrayal, and the strength of family. Samantha stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the turkey for the last time. It was the first Thanksgiving in their new house, the one she and Ethan had worked so hard for over the past 3 years. The three-bedroom colonial, nestled in a quiet suburb, had been their dream. But standing there, amid the scent of cinnamon and roasted turkey, she felt a tightness in her chest that no amount of stuffing could fix. Ethan had been distant for weeks. It was subtle at first, small things like not being home for dinner or scrolling through his phone when she spoke to him. But tonight, as the house filled with his family, the distance had grown, manifesting in a cold silence that hung in the air like a fog. She had hoped the dinner would be different. She had spent hours planning it, perfectly arranged place settings, a playlist of soft jazz in the background, cloth napkins with gold trim, and even little place cards she'd printed herself. Everything was supposed to feel like love, like unity. It was her way of proving to his family that she belonged, that she was worthy of the life she and Ethan had built together. But the moment the doorbell rang and his mother, Jessica, walked in with that tight smile on her face, Samantha knew something was off. Jessica barely glanced at her, only offering a quick kiss to Leo, her grandson, before commenting on the centerpiece. "You bought this, didn't you? Looks store-bought." The remark stung. She smiled through it, like she always did. But it was hard to ignore the undercurrent of judgment that had existed between them for years. Even Ethan didn't seem to notice. He came down the stairs late, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar like he was the star of some show that had no rehearsal. He hugged his mother and gave her a brief nod before taking his seat at the head of the table. As the night wore on, Samantha kept telling herself to hold it together. The meal was perfect. The turkey was golden and crisp, the pies were homemade, and Leo had drawn little pictures for everyone at the table. Tiny stick figures with glitter stickers that made his heart shine brighter than anything. He had even made one for Jessica that said, "Happy Turkey Day," but Samantha could see her mother-in-law barely glanced at it. Samantha's smile wavered, but she stayed silent. She always stayed silent, because if she spoke up, they would call her oversensitive. If she didn't, they would think she didn't care. The laughter that rang out when Jessica made a comment about the turkey's brine, or lack of, felt hollow. Ethan didn't look at her once. Not a single compliment on the meal, not a word of acknowledgement. He was too busy talking about sports with his brother, too busy texting under the table. His presence felt like a ghost, hovering over her, mocking everything she had done to make this day perfect. But the breaking point came after dessert. Samantha had made her homemade pecan pie, the one she had spent hours perfecting, and everyone was happily digging in when Ethan, looking relaxed, leaned back in his chair and took a sip of his whiskey. He looked at her, his eyes narrowed, and said, "You don't even know who the real father is." At first, Samantha thought she had misheard him. She laughed, an awkward chuckle escaping her lips, thinking it was some strange joke. But when she looked around the table, the laughter wasn't the usual noise that accompanied a silly remark. It was real, genuine. His mother, Jessica, was smiling in that way she did when she was waiting for something to come to light. Ethan's brother, Derek, even laughed, but Samantha froze. Leo, sitting next to her, stopped eating. His little fork was still in his hand, and his face had gone pale. He was listening. He had heard every word, every joke, every insult they had ever whispered behind her back, and something in him snapped. Samantha's heart raced as she watched her son. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about Leo, the child she had carried, loved, and protected. The child they had all treated like he was invisible. But now, he wasn't having it. Leo, 7 years old, thin in his plaid shirt, stood up slowly. His little chair scraped against the floor, and the room fell silent. Samantha reached out instinctively, but Leo pulled his hand away gently. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't confused. His gaze was steady as he looked around the table, not just at the people who had mocked him, but at the people who had no idea what he was about to say. "Actually," Leo said, his voice clear and calm, "I know who he is." The room went dead silent. Not a single sound, not even a breath. Everyone's eyes turned to Leo, and in that moment, Samantha realized something. This wasn't her moment anymore. This was Leo's. "I know who my real dad is," Leo continued, his voice unwavering. "It's not Micah. It's him," he said, pointing at George, Samantha's father, who had been sitting silently until now, his eyes wide with a mix of surprise and tenderness. Samantha's breath caught in her chest. Her father had been the one who showed up every time when no one else did. He had been there for Leo when Ethan wasn't. The moments Leo had shared with him, the bedtime stories, the rides to school, the support at every school event. George had been the father figure Leo needed, and in that moment, Leo had found his voice. Ethan sat frozen, his glass of whiskey still in hand. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jessica's smile faltered, and Derek's face went pale. The family was no longer laughing. They were trying to process the truth that had just been laid bare. Ethan was the first to break the silence, but his voice was shaky, defensive. "Leo, sit down," he barked, but Leo stood his ground. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he said firmly. "You're not really my dad. Not really." Samantha felt her heart swell with pride for her son. It was the bravest thing she had ever witnessed. She reached for Leo, but he pulled away, steady on his feet, his eyes locked with Ethan's. The air in the room was thick with tension. Ethan tried to laugh it off, tried to call it a joke, but the damage had been done. Samantha stood up slowly, her voice quiet but sharp. "You humiliated me in front of our son," she said, "and now you're calling it a joke?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. For the first time, he looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Uncertainty. He didn't know what to say anymore. Samantha turned to her father, her voice unwavering. "You've been Leo's real father all along. You're the one who's been there when it mattered." And then, with one last look at Ethan, she turned to Leo, her son, and whispered, "You did good, baby." How do you find the courage to speak the truth when it feels like the world is against you? What would you do if your own family questioned the most important part of your life? The silence in the room was deafening, but Leo's words had already shifted everything. What would happen when Samantha and Leo walked away from the life they had built, and what would Ethan do when he realized the consequences of his actions? Find out in the next chapter. The days that followed that Thanksgiving were quiet in a way Samantha had never known before. It wasn't the absence of noise, though there was plenty of that, but something heavier, something deeper. She had expected chaos. Micah storming out, the family gossiping behind her back. Instead, it was like the house had been swallowed by the weight of what Leo had said. Micah didn't come back that night. He didn't come back the next day either. It was the first time in years that the house felt like her own. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was a kind of peace she hadn't realized she was desperate for. Leo had taken the night with ease. He went to bed at his usual hour, not a single complaint, no tears. He climbed under the covers in his dinosaur pajamas, cuddled up with his favorite plush, and asked her to tell him a story. His face was calm, too calm for a child who had just publicly exposed his father's lies. But then again, Leo had always been mature for his age, too aware of the cracks that ran through their family. Samantha sat beside him, watching the rhythm of his breathing, as if he could erase all of the tension in the room simply by existing. She wondered how long he had been carrying this weight, the weight of knowing more than he was ever supposed to, the weight of seeing the truth before anyone else did. Her phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. It was a text from her dad. "You did the right thing. But I know this is far from over. We're here when you're ready to talk. Love you." She exhaled. The words were kind, comforting even. But they also reminded her of how much she had left to process, how much she still had to decide. What did it mean to stand up for the truth? To break free from the family she had tried so hard to be accepted by? The same family that had mocked her son, that had betrayed her without hesitation, was now watching her, watching them. The truth felt like a double-edged sword. On one hand, it had given her strength, given Leo strength, but on the other, it had shredded her life. Ethan had been absent, both physically and emotionally, for months now. But now, after that dinner, after Leo's declaration, there was no more pretending. The lie had been exposed. Yet Micah still wasn't coming back. And Samantha knew, deep down, that even if he did, it wouldn't matter. Because the man she married, the man who had promised to love and protect her, was no longer the man sitting at their dinner table. The words he'd thrown so carelessly were too much to forgive. But even more painful than that realization was the looming truth she hadn't fully faced, the truth about her. About the choices she had made to stay, to endure the silence, the neglect, the hurt, to convince herself that things would get better, that she could hold the family together. She glanced down at Leo, his tiny fists clenched under the blankets, the boy who had stood in front of all of them and spoken the truth, the boy who had, in that moment, found more courage than she ever thought she had. Samantha's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She froze, her heart beating a little faster. She knew it was too soon. Too soon for Micah to show up, but the knock sounded too familiar to ignore. She stood up, her legs shaky, and made her way to the door. When she opened it, she didn't see Micah. Instead, it was her sister, Chloe, standing there with a concerned expression. She was holding a bag of takeout, her eyes wide as if she had just been through a storm of her own. "I brought dinner," Chloe said softly. "I thought we could talk. You, me, and Leo. Is that okay?" Samantha felt a lump rise in her throat. Chloe had always been the one to hold things together when everything else was falling apart. She was the one who had shown up when Samantha needed someone to take the burden, even if it meant not asking questions. But now, Chloe was here, vulnerable, searching for answers that neither of them had. Samantha stepped aside, allowing her sister to come in. Leo looked up from the couch as she entered, his gaze unreadable, like he had known she would be there all along. "I think we need to talk too," Samantha said quietly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But not just about what happened with Micah, about everything." Chloe nodded, sitting down beside Samantha on the couch, but her gaze quickly flicked to Leo. He had grown quiet again, his gaze fixed on the window, his tiny hands gripping his dinosaur plush tightly. Samantha could see the gears turning in his mind, as though he was calculating his next move, deciding when he'd speak next. "Samantha," Chloe began, her voice soft but steady, "are you sure about this? About leaving him? About not going back?" The question hit harder than she expected. The weight of the choice was sinking in. For years, she had told herself that she could make it work, that if she just tried harder, if she made herself indispensable, things would turn around. But now, in the quiet of her home, with Leo sitting across from her, it didn't feel right. She wasn't just leaving Ethan. She was leaving behind a version of herself that had tried to hold it all together, a version that had convinced herself that pain could be fixed with effort and love. "I don't know," Samantha admitted, her voice shaking. I thought I was doing the right thing all these years. I thought I could hold it all together, that I could make it work. But now, I don't know who I am without him, without that family. But Leo is different now." Chloe reached over and took her hand, her grip firm. "You're different too, and you don't need him to be whole. You never did." Samantha looked at her sister, the truth echoing louder than anything Micah could say. Maybe Chloe was right. Maybe it wasn't just about surviving anymore. Maybe it was about living, truly living, with honesty and love. And then, just as the air between them began to clear, Leo spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice low but steady, "you're not the one who's broken. He is." Samantha's heart stilled. She looked at him, his tiny face full of wisdom beyond his years. He had spoken his truth. and in that moment, she realized something. Maybe she wasn't the only one who needed to heal. Maybe it was time for her to stop fixing things and start letting go. How do you rebuild your life when the person you trusted most has shattered everything you thought you knew? Can healing come from the most unexpected sources? Samantha stood in front of Leo, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the beginning of something new. But what came next? Could she finally free herself from the chains of her past and create a future filled with love and truth? She turned to Chloe, her eyes brimming with unspoken emotion. I have to make a choice, Samantha said softly, the weight of the future pressing down on her shoulders. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel afraid of the answer. The story was far from over, and the hardest part had only just begun. The days that followed the confrontation felt like a blur, like the world was still spinning around Samantha and Leo while they stood, frozen in place, watching everything they had known crumble. But in that chaos, something was beginning to form, something strong, something real. Micah didn't return. It wasn't an apology or a grand gesture of reconciliation. He simply didn't come back. His absence was deafening, but it didn't hurt as much as Samantha had expected it to. There were no tearful phone calls, no pleading to come home, just silence. And it was in that silence that Samantha began to breathe. She felt it slowly, then all at once. The freedom. Her house, once a stage for the lies they had lived, began to feel like her home again. She no longer needed to pretend that everything was fine, that her life was perfect. For the first time in years, she could let go of the fear of being exposed, let go of the guilt that had followed her, that had made her feel like she was always running, always trying to fix what was broken. Leo, too, seemed lighter. He had changed in ways Samantha couldn't fully understand yet. But when she looked at him, really looked at him, she saw the boy who had stood up in front of his entire family and spoken the truth. He was no longer the quiet child who hid behind his smile. He was strong, resilient, and at peace in ways that even she was still learning to be. But as they began to find their rhythm, Samantha felt the tug of an unresolved piece of her heart. Her relationship with Micah wasn't just about him. It was about the version of herself that she had built around him. She had given so much, not just to the relationship, but to the illusion of what they were supposed to be, to the image of the perfect family. And now that she was free from it, she was left to pick up the fragments of who she had been before. One afternoon, as she sat in the living room, her hands absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the coffee table, the doorbell rang. She knew who it was before she even opened the door. The man standing on the other side, with his face as unreadable as ever, was Micah. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Samantha could feel the weight of everything that had passed between them. The laughter, the insults, the betrayal, the moments that had once been filled with love. Now, all of it was in the air, hanging there like dust in a forgotten room. I came to talk, Micah said, his voice hoarse, as if the words had been sitting in his throat for too long. Samantha nodded and stepped aside, not sure what to expect. Leo, who had been sitting on the couch, didn't look up. He didn't need to. Micah had already lost his place in their lives. They sat in the kitchen, where they used to talk about their future, where they used to laugh and plan. The silence between them now was filled with the weight of broken promises. I'm sorry, Micah said after a long while. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am. Samantha didn't respond immediately. She had spent so long convincing herself that his apologies would mean something, that they would be the key to fixing everything. But now, hearing him say those words, they felt hollow. Too little, too late. I wanted to be the man you needed, Micah continued, his voice trembling slightly. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I lost you too, and I can't ask you to forgive me. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. Samantha looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man broken by his own choices. But it didn't make her pain go away. It didn't undo the years of neglect, the years of feeling invisible. She had spent so much time trying to fix him, to fix them, that she had forgotten how to be whole on her own. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said quietly, her voice steady. "But what I do know is that I'm done carrying this weight. I'm done pretending. Leo and I, we're moving forward. Without you." Micah didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at her, as if trying to absorb the reality of her words. He had always been the one to make decisions, to control the narrative, but now it was her turn to define her own story. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Samantha added, standing up from the table. "And I hope you understand why I can't be the person you need me to be anymore. Because I'm finally learning how to be the person I need to be. For me. For Leo." With that, she turned and walked into the living room. Leo was still on the couch, his back to her, but Samantha could see the tension in his small shoulders had eased. He had been waiting for this moment, too. Micah stood there, in the kitchen, silent and still. And when Samantha walked past him, she didn't flinch. She didn't feel the old pang of guilt that used to follow her every time they had a difficult conversation. She was free. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, therapy sessions, and new routines. Samantha didn't have time to dwell on what Micah's absence meant for her. Instead, she focused on Leo, on building a life for them that was centered on truth, love, and the peace they had fought so hard to claim. She learned to stop trying to fix things and started learning how to let go of the things that no longer served her. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Leo looked up at her with his soft brown eyes, his gaze full of understanding. "You know," Leo said quietly, "I think I'm finally starting to understand what you meant when you said we don't have to be perfect to be happy." Samantha smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Yeah, kiddo, you're right." They sat there in the fading light, side by side, as the world continued on around them. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but for the first time in years, it was theirs. What is the price of freedom when it means letting go of everything you thought you knew? Have you ever had to choose between your happiness and someone else's? If you enjoyed this story, comment 100 to show your support. Where are you watching from? Share this video with your friends, and thank you for tuning in to Life Stories.